Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for another Restless event with our partners, My Menopause Centre. On this occasion, we are looking at making the most of CBT to manage your menopause symptoms. So before I hand over to Helen, who will chair this evening's event, I just wanted to remind you of a couple of points. Please post your questions and thoughts in the chat function at the bottom of your screens. Feel free to post throughout the presentation. There will also be time for questions at the end. The event will run for an hour and will be recorded and mailed to all who registered for it once it finishes. So I'd now like to hand over to our panel chair, Helen Normall, who is co-founder of My Menopause Centre. Helen has held Chief Marketing Officer roles across the healthcare, beauty, broadcast, furniture and property sectors, and is a self-described women's wellness champion. So over to you, Helen. Let me spotlight you now.
Super, thank you so much, Mahalia, for that introduction. And good evening, everyone. And thank you so much for joining tonight's webinar. As Mahalia said, we're going to talk about making the most of CBT to manage your menopause symptoms. Now, many women are surprised when they hear that CBT is a safe and effective way of managing a range of both physical and psychological menopause symptoms. Now, Dr. Clare, my co-founder at My Menopause Centre and a brilliant menopause doctor and GP, an absolute expert in this area, but we both believe that knowledge is truly empowering. And that's why we're delighted to be joined by Darren Woodward, who's a psychotherapist and principal at Livelife. Now, Darren is a qualified psychotherapist and a senior manager in a large national social enterprise Turning Point, where they support over 150,000 people each year across the country in over 100 locations and also virtually. And he's worked within health and social care for almost 30 years. Now, we're so delighted to have Darren's expertise on the webinar with us this evening. You can put your questions, as Mahalia said, into the chat. And as I'm sure you'll appreciate though, the team, Darren and Claire, won't be able to answer individual specific medical inquiries, but they can, of course, respond at a broader level. So, CBT, Claire, Dr. Clare, has been in the news for quite a bit over the last few days. So before we kick off, it would be really helpful if you could maybe talk us through why CBT has been in the news and what was mentioned in the updated draft guidelines from NICE, and indeed explain what NICE is.
Yes, thank you, Helen, and good evening, everybody. It's great to be here again. So CBT stands for cognitive behavioural therapy, and I know that Darren's going to talk about what exactly that is and what that means in a moment, but just let me fill you in a little bit on what you may have read about in the news over the weekend particularly. So NICE stands for the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. And this is a government body that aims to help practitioners get the best care to patients. And they have independent committees who write guidelines. The committees are made up of independent professionals and lay members, and you have to be able to be completely independent to join those committees. And the aim of the committee and the aim of the guideline then is to improve health and well-being by putting science and evidence at the heart of health and care decision making. And so in terms of the menopause and where that sits for the menopause is the last menopause guidance was actually published a number of years ago in 2015. And on Friday, the draft updated guidelines were published, and they really highlighted the fact that they'd reviewed new evidence since the last guideline had been published for the effectiveness of cognitive behavioural therapy as just one option to help manage menopause symptoms. So again, the emphasis was very much on this is not one size fits all, that HRT was at the front and foremost as a way of managing menopause symptoms, but it acknowledged that not all women want to take HRT or have been or can take HRT. Some women are advised that it may be too risky for them. And so the guidance then looks at all of the evidence for and against all the different types of other ways of managing menopause symptoms. And so this guideline reviewed the evidence that showed CBT could help depressive symptoms, that it could help sleep, and that it may help vasomotor symptoms, so hot flushes and night sweats, with reduction in frequency and severity, and also how much they interfered and impacted on quality of life. So it really highlighted those 3 areas of being able to help when women were struggling in those 3 areas: sleep, depressive symptoms, vasomotor symptoms, in the menopause specifically.
Brilliant, thank you, Claire. I think it's really important and really helpful to clarify what came out and what was published. It did get quite a lot of media coverage last week. But Darren, as we were preparing for today's session on Friday, the 3 of us said what great timing it was, because it is very topical and will be front of mind. And I know as an advocate for CBT, Claire, you were really pleased to see the very clear recommendation that was coming through from NICE. So Darren, we'll start with the basics. Just exactly what does CBT stand for, and what actually is it?
Thanks, Helen, and thanks, Claire. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. So CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, is a well-respected, evidence-based type of treatment. Cognitive, the cognitions are our thoughts, behaviour are our actions, and this approach, which is in essence and has to be collaborative, is also quite a structured approach to therapy. It's slightly different from counselling. People may be more familiar with counselling. Within counselling, the client sets the agenda, and the positive therapeutic relationship between the client and the therapist will kind of explore these kind of issues. With CBT, it's slightly different, where the therapist is a bit more proactive, has a more proactive role, and tries to address the presenting problems, which are kind of sought through an assessment using evidence-based pathways. So these pathways are predetermined. And for CBT, there are 2 kind of main types of thinking. You've got the first type, which are the ordinary and kind of fleeting thoughts and images, and then you've also got the underlying beliefs and assumptions that give rise to these thoughts and images, and that distinction is really important in terms of therapy, and I'll talk more about that later. So happy to talk a bit more, Helen, if you want me to say more about what CBT is, or if you want another question.
No, I think that's a very helpful overview, and in a moment I will put a link into the chat for an article that one of your colleagues wrote for us, Darren, about the benefits of cognitive behavioural therapy. So if people want to read a little bit more into detail after the webinar, then they can. And Anita, I'll also paste where Darren is from and his bio as well into the chat. So before we come to menopause specifically, Darren, it would be really helpful in general, where do your patients find CBT helpful?
They find CBT helpful in a variety of ways, but often it can be the case that when someone presents for therapy, they don't know about CBT, they don't know about counselling, they just know that things don't feel great. They don't know often what the main cause or problem is, and it's only through kind of speaking to a professional, often GP, that can help signpost you towards a therapy service. Can you begin to tease out and kind of understand some of these kind of issues? So essentially all types of therapy, including CBT, starts with a clinical assessment. The clinical assessment is generally pretty holistic. It looks at all parts of one's life, and that in itself has got value. It's got real value to kind of to stop and to kind of start talking in quite a structured way about the impact of each of those areas in one's life. And so through that assessment, the collaborative process, it's important then to work out well, what should we focus on first? What comes first? And I think that CBT is sometimes grouped together in one type. There are different types of CBT. And these different types of CBT are delivered by different types of therapists with different training. And so just before I outline what that difference is, it's maybe worth kind of just going back a little bit and saying a bit more about CBT first. That it's not the events that people explain about, whether it's anxiety or low mood that produce bad feelings, but it's the way that we appraise those events. It's our interpretations of our experiences that matter. These are, in CBT views, they're hypotheses or beliefs. They're not facts, and they're correct to kind of varying degrees. So sometimes when people hold unrealistic or negative beliefs about themselves or their experiences, it can create an emotional upset. And if this negative thinking is extreme or persistent, it may well lead to an emotional disorder. So, for example, if someone's feeling depressed, it might be as a consequence of the false beliefs that their life is not pointless, or it's pointless, or it's worthless. And the kind of central aim of CBT of all types is to be able to replace those kind of beliefs and concentrate, and which contribute to kind of self-defeating behaviour, with beliefs that are more associated with self-acceptance and that are more constructive and more kind of problem solving. So that's the kind of main thrust behind all types of CBT. But in terms of accessing a therapy, so having access to an assessment, and we can talk a bit about how that is accessed maybe later, that there are two main types of CBT. So one is called low intensity. I don't think the term's too important. And then there's high intensity. Low intensity, you can have up to usually about 6 sessions. The sessions are usually about 30 minutes long. They can be delivered by video, by the phone, in person, and they can also use an online platform. So often accessing therapy through your GPs with the NHS, what's called a talking therapy service. That first low intensity treatment, you'll access an online CBT, or have access to an online CBT platform as well. And in between the sessions, you may well do some homework. High intensity is according to NICE. It recommends that if there is a single incident of trauma, then the therapist, which is a CBT therapist, which is differently trained from the person that delivers the low intensity training, will do up to 8 to 12 sessions. If somebody has anxiety or obsessive compulsive disorder, they recommend about 10 to 12 sessions. If there's more complex trauma, then it's usually about 18 to 20 sessions is recommended. And if it's recurring depression, it's up to 20 sessions. So much longer for the kind of high intensity, and shorter both in terms of how long the session is and the kind of number of sessions for the low intensity. And often, if people access the low intensity CBT, they may well kind of identify some underlying issues that they could access through counselling. But this, might be a bridge or a springboard to be able to access that when they previously couldn't.
And Darren, who decides, and when do you typically decide if a low or high intensity approach is best for your patient?
It's always with the assessment. And so somebody comes through and there's a structured assessment, and through discussion with the person, there is a kind of agreement about which is the priority issue. But there is also, again, within many services, a kind of strange term called caseness, which is essentially the complexity or the acuity that someone's experiencing. And that's determined usually with a number of validated measures. So we have tools that measure anxiety, measure depression, and a whole range of different things to do with a series of questions, and that produces a caseness score. So if somebody's kind of low to moderate complexity, they'll have low intensity CBT, and if somebody has greater risk or greater complexity, they'll generally have high intensity. If somebody scores very, very high, obviously we'd signpost them towards a specialist service and try and safeguard any kind of risk there. But that's generally how it can happen within therapy as well, if kind of problems occur throughout therapy, as can often be the case. Sometimes things can get worse, before they get better, or new issues can arise, as therapy is occurring. Generally, within talking therapy services, the therapy focuses on the presenting problem that comes from assessment. And so if there was a new formulation that needed to address a new presenting problem, it would probably be a new referral. But
Okay.
generally within private practice, that isn't the issue.
Okay, that's really helpful just to understand the process and how you ensure you're on the right track and the right type of CBT.
Yeah.
And then when you're actually having a session and using CBT with the patient, how does that actually work? And I think you've got a nifty visual to help explain this.
Here's a Blue Peter one I prepared earlier. So see if I can share my screen. Just 1 second. So this is a cross-sectional formulation, just an outline of what may well be something. So this is a kind of real life case. So essentially, an emotive or upsetting experience can happen, and that's over here. I send a message to my friend to invite her for dinner. She hasn't got back to me after an hour, and that's kind of evocative and kind of very upsetting. It can kind of spark irrational or intrusive thoughts, such as, she doesn't want to come, I must have done something wrong to upset her, she must be annoyed with me. And then through the therapy, this is just an example, the therapist and the client can link some of these thoughts to other behaviours, bodily sensations, and emotions. The behaviour may well be as a consequence of that I drink too much wine and eat junk food. I don't message or call my friend, and I withdraw and isolate myself as a consequence of this. The bodily sensation is that I'm kind of feeling heavy in my body. I've got a kind of churning sensation in my stomach, and I feel sick, and emotionally I'm kind of anxious and feeling worthless and sad. And so you can kind of see how these link to values and beliefs. But the kind of importance of therapy is to first of all notice these things, then maybe after time to categorizing. Well, actually, this is something that happens frequently, and through that kind of noticing and through that categorization, I'll stop sharing. That we can kind of begin to challenge. So the therapist can, in a very collaborative way, kind of point out, some discrepancies. No, it doesn't seem like that's a fact. It seems like it's a belief, and challenge within the person's frame. And hopefully with that trusting relationship, you can begin to build up the skills to be able to challenge one's intrusive or automatic or irrational thoughts as they come through. So it does take time. It's not a silver bullet. It does take a fair bit of work, and the more intense the emotion, the more intense the kind of the reaction, the harder it is to challenge those. But that's the idea.
And how surprising is it for people when they start to see and they learn that they're not necessarily their beliefs, or the beliefs, when they become aware of their beliefs and they can observe them and then realize they're not necessarily true? Because I've used CBT, and that was an incredible insight it's almost to detach yourself from something and to look at it. Yes. And then think about it.
I think it's an incredible privilege to be kind of part of that as a therapist, to see something that someone's been so caught up with, and it can be the thought, the kind of specific thought, but more about the symbolism of it. You think, well, actually, I've been caught on many different thoughts, many intrusive thoughts, and giving someone the tool to say, actually, I've learned something where I can challenge this in a way that I couldn't before. I felt like I was a slave to it. I've worked with people before that have ruminated on a certain issue, or they've had some obsessive acts like picking skin, or or scratching their nails or something, and almost moving away from the activity, the kind of thoughts that can be kind of very intrusive, giving somebody the skills or working together to build the skills is incredible. And it's also great to see over the period of a number of sessions, to see those skills being put into practice more and more and more, and people feeling more confident with it. So yeah, it's great to feel like you're giving someone a tool.
Yeah, it's an amazing job, I think, that you have and do, and Dr. Clare as well, to give somebody that life skill, because you can apply it in so many other situations as well than when you have it. And then, Claire, you know, in your extensive experience, what are the menopause symptoms that you find, both physical and psychological, where you found CBT has really helped your patients?
Yeah, so as NICE have highlighted those domains of sort of more depressive symptoms of the menopause, sleep issues, which are so common, and vasomotor. But I think what I hear a lot in my clinics is those dreadful, as Darren sort of said, vicious cycles that just get set up and people fall into. So, for example, with sleep, I know that we'll talk about it a little bit more in a minute, but you know, if you can't sleep, we know there's really high risk of then having emotional problems and making depressive symptoms worse. The sort of anxiety that then gets set up around sleep, and the belief that you're never ever going to get to sleep as soon as you get into bed, the negativity of that's it, I'm going to lie in bed and be awake. And you know, as Darren said, the vicious cycle of the sort of belief turning into self-perpetuating issue. And also, I mean, a really simple example, I think, is when women have issues with memory, so tricky cognitive symptoms of the menopause. So we know that incredibly common, 70 to 80% of women will have issues with memory, and that awful brain fog when your head just feels full of cotton wool. And again, just getting into an awful vicious cycle. I've got no memory, this is it, this is early dementia, I'm going to, and then that feeds into anxiety. And HRT is a really wonderful thing and really helps many symptoms, but it often doesn't help all symptoms. And so I really see that CBT can be really so helpful in sort of breaking down some of those vicious cycles that, as Darren showed us, get set up in your head. I think this is why I feel so strongly that it can be so helpful, as well as CBT, as well as lifestyle changes, as well as sort of yoga and breathing and mindful, you know, all the other different ways that people can look at to help manage their symptoms. I think just understanding where your thoughts are coming from when your hormones are just making your brain just feel like this completely wild, erratic thing. You know, women will say to me that they just feel they've lost their sense of self. They don't know who they are anymore. You know, the change in hormones equal change in chemicals, equal change in how you're thinking. I think just trying to understand and unpick that with something like CBT can be incredibly helpful. So yeah, so sorry, that was my long answer. Many symptoms, although, you know, NICE just highlighted sleep, depression and vasomotor.
It probably a really good segue in, Claire, to think of maybe have a discussion between you and Darren around some case studies. So maybe kicking off with you to think about, maybe describe a patient who might come to you that you might refer on to somebody like Darren, an expert like Darren for CBT. And Anna Maria, we will definitely come to your question about how to access CBT. We'll just do the case studies first, and then we'll come to that.
Yes, Darren, I mean, you must have seen this, but so in my clinic, it's not uncommon to have referrals for women who've had, say, a diagnosis of breast cancer or undergoing treatment for breast cancer. So they've been advised not to take HRT, and many women are really struggling. So they're dealing with their diagnosis of breast cancer. They're having hot flushes and night sweats. They may be awake 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 times during the night, you know, hot flushes several times every hour during the day, trying to hold down a job, feeling that their brain is full of cotton wool. That sort of feeds then into anxiety, feelings of low self-worth, feelings of awfulness, as well as a lot of the anger and why me that comes with a diagnosis of breast cancer. So how would you, so I would always recommend trying to access CBT. And how would you tackle somebody coming to you with those sorts of symptoms?
Well, you're absolutely right, and it's not uncommon. It's very common, and whether people can't or don't want to take HRT, and whether they are on HRT and managing some of the symptoms while they are, all therapy, as I mentioned before, starts with an assessment, and the assessment or any type of therapy is no good, no matter how qualified somebody is, if you don't have a positive rapport. And I just would say this, that if anybody does access any type of therapy, if it doesn't feel right, it doesn't feel like it clicks, then change. And that goes for every type of therapy, whether you're paying for yourself, whether it's free upon delivery, whether it's through your employer, that you've always got the right to do that. And that is across the board. There's been a huge amount of research. The most important factor in terms of outcomes from therapy, including CBT. But the process of presenting, the list that you kind of presented there, Claire, is huge. It's difficult to ascertain which bit do I start with? Is this true? But having a space that you can trust and you feel comfortable that you can be heard is really important. And you may well have friends or family or people that that you can do that with, but I think that the therapy is different. This is the contract. This is what therapy is. Therapy is that space. And so having that trusting environment in which you can, relay how things are and uncover and discover, each of these issues is really important. But it's also really important to try and provide some track. You think, well, when I first started therapy, it's difficult to kind of look back 2 or 3 weeks to kind of recognize if there's any impact. Now, whether it's sleep, whether it's anxiety, it's kind of low mood, it can all feel like it's all whirling around. But being able to disaggregate and prioritize and work on in a phased way each of these issues, and while doing so, just chart some of the progress. So, CBT is very good at kind of having scales in relation to anxiety, scales in relation to low mood. That some of the work that we do in Live Life is particularly in relation to hot flushes and night sweats, some of the therapists that we have. So there are scales in relation to that. So being able to look back over weeks and weeks can provide a challenge. This is just the same. I don't feel any better. Well, according to you, it is better, or actually it's worse. But you can do that demonstrably through CBT. And I think the kind of the reference that was made, before to catastrophizing, that it's all going to go to the dogs, and and it's all going to end terribly. There are a number of different ways of whether someone's got a crystal ball and they're imagining what people are thinking, or that it's all going to end well. These negative kind of belief systems and thinking patterns are easy to kind of to notice, to describe, to categorize and challenge. And being able to do that in a safe way, in a prioritized way, can discern some of the wood for the trees. And it's also really important that between therapy sessions, that there's an opportunity to build on the work that you do, and do homework in between sessions, or maybe not call it homework, doesn't sound that appealing, but do work that builds on the content that you're talking about with your therapist, and then return back to therapy to talk about whether it's a behavior experiment. You think, well, actually I'm trying to expose the kind of the anxiety, or expose the concern in a situation that I've talked about with my therapist, then come back to the safe environment of therapy to discuss it. It's really hard to have something like that outside of therapy, outside of CBT. So it may be a bit of a kind of a jumbled response, but hopefully in articulating that there's a process which is, you know, deriving the pathway or the discussion of which bit to address first through the assessment.
No, that's really helpful. And so, Darren, I know, so particularly on social media and over the weekend, there's been a lot of skepticism of how CBT and a talking therapy can help such a dramatic physical symptom like a hot flush, where many of my patients tell me they wake up, they're drenched. And in the daytime, they feel they turn bright red. And again, soaking through a shirt. So I know I know the evidence shows, you know, reduction in severity, number, and impact of hot flushes. But could you talk a little bit about how a talking therapy can help such a vivid, dramatic physical symptom?
Sure. There's two short answers to that. Is one that mind and body are connected. You know, if we have a kind of physical sensation, it's likely to be impacted or caused, you know, by a kind of a non-physical mental kind of reaction, a social encounter. And so, you know, to kind of separate the two and think, well, you know, there can't be, how could it possibly, is saying there's no use in therapy at all. And secondly, there's a really important part about being able to manage or cope with a physical sensation, and that might not, you know, stop it completely, but the way in which you respond to that. So a good example might be embarrassment or, you know, fear of public speaking. That by working on and talking to and practicing, that there's a different response physically. We are embodied, you know, beings, and that there is no kind of massive, you know, distinction between mind and body. They are connected, and so being able to, you know, like I said before, discuss, relay, and explore the interaction between thoughts and behaviours is the fundamental principles of all psychology. And so it might not stop all, and there's evidence that's difficult to prove. If Professor Myra Hunter were here, she'd be able to far more articulately, you know, give the evidence base behind all of the assertions and pinning all that evidence than I can. But I think just to kind of, you know, to cut through some of the you know, the headlines that are kind of attention grabbing, and kind of think more kind of fundamentally about, well, what's the value of therapy? And you know, this is one presentation of one, you know, very important element of therapy. And yeah, so I don't know if that's explained it.
Yeah, no, it does. So I think, have I understood it correctly? So you might start having a hot flush, and you might then start catastrophizing that in your brain. So you're thinking, oh my goodness, this is dreadful. I'm going to go bright red and look really sweaty.
That's right.
And so you then feed into that. You might release more stress hormone, very basically. You might, and so if you can talk through that cycle with somebody like yourself, and learn to break some of that vicious cycle that then gets set up, and sort of almost diminish the impact in your brain.
Absolutely.
Is that right? So it feels worse. It doesn't feel as bad.
Exactly that. And you know, within lots of the work that we do, we support people with, you know, mindful kind of practice and, you know, breathing techniques, and being able to kind of, you know, break those thoughts, those automatic thoughts. In a similar vein, we do a lot of work with people that have panic attacks. And so, you know, I don't know if, you know, people have had panic attack before, but the first time someone has a panic attack, they think, I'm gonna die. I'm having a heart attack, you know, and it's so unusual, and it builds and builds and builds, and then sometimes people have panic attacks because they're worried about having a panic attack. Able to kind of address that in therapy and try to discern some of the kind of the myths and beliefs from facts, and provide some coping strategies to help people to kind of think through that behavior, think through that fear, is very similar.
Yes, no, it's really fascinating. It's such a powerful way. It's such a powerful tool, isn't it? And so how about, so another really quite common scenario is I obviously see women a number of times. Might be during the year, it might be over 2 years, it might be 3 years, and we've tweaked the HRT, we've got rid of the hot flushes, we've got rid of many symptoms, that say, for example, sleep will still be a major issue. And then, you know, all of the negativity around sleep and that feeling of being out of control and helplessness. So somebody on HRT, but still lingering either psychological symptoms or still lingering sleep issues, which is really quite common, I have to say.
Yeah.
How would you approach something like that?
Well, I think that all therapy won't cause or won't address all malaise, but that all therapy will provide a platform to be able to work towards it. And you know, sleep is just another example of there's a huge amount that therapy can do and CBT can do with helping sleep, you know, sleep hygiene, being able to kind of, you know, understand the getting prepared for sleep, you know, the managing the thoughts when you're not able to sleep, techniques about how to manage sleep when you're not sleeping, what to do when you're not sleeping, but importantly, being able to kind of bring that back to therapy and talk about it in the session, and just tweak and modify and introduce new ideas. And it's also, although it's a range of clinically validated pathways about what can be suggested, there's lots of materials that can be kind of shared in advance, you know, visual, kind of audio, you know, techniques to help people. But it's also quite playful, and it's a way in which you can try something else and try something else, and that you'll find, as long as you have a good positive relationship with your therapist, and you've got, you know, the trust and you know, the confidence to be able to share intimate kind of issues, then it's amazing what can happen. And you know, whether it's about anxiety or sleep, or whether someone's on, you know, a small amount of HRT or a different amount of HRT than that they were before, it's always personal. It's what the person sees as their presenting issue, and that can change and change and change. And so, yeah, it might sound like I'm just advocating therapy for life, and I'm not. I think it needs to be kind of, you know, focused on a topic that's agreed, that's agreed through an assessment, and that the treatment that's agreed is kind of in line with an evidence-based pathway that's said before.
No, that completely makes sense. And I think just as a final one, I'd maybe say fatigue is another really common issue in the menopause transition, that HRT or testosterone, you know, really doesn't solve. And you hear women will say that I've stopped going out, and I just don't see my friends anymore. I'm not exercising, and you just want to be able to just break through that, because you know that if you could just get through that hump and start doing a little bit more, that, yeah, is that something that maybe CBT could?
Yeah, I mean, it's very common. And again, you know, we need to kind of be holistic with this, and not be too kind of focused on, you know, that we recognise, as I said before, you know, mind and body connected. But often, you know, people that are lethargic or don't have any energy can often feel low. You know, symptoms of kind of low mood can feel like that people don't have any energy, and you know, it can be drawn from the person, but you know, building connections, building activity, and being able to bring that back and think, well, so what did that do in terms of your energy levels? What did that do in terms of your social anxiety? What did that do in terms of your future? So not just seeing it as a kind of solipsistic kind of individual kind of issue. It's kind of connected to all of those things. Inherently, we're relational. You know, we're kind of connected beings. So if we don't, that kind of impacts on how we feel. We're also active, and if we don't, that impacts on how we feel and think too. So being able to kind of broadly kind of look at that in a round and review that week on week with you know, trying different things is is pretty impactful.
Yeah, no, and I really love that ongoing relationship that you described, that try something, feedback, did that work, didn't it work? You know, you don't feel any different, but actually, how did you feel after you went for a walk, spoke to a friend? Yes, that continuity.
Yeah, I still feel rubbish. Well, how rubbish do you feel? And compared to 2-3 weeks ago, actually, you don't seem to be as rubbish as you felt. And you know, that's kind of showing kind of progress when you don't really feel it. And it might well be, okay, I have been going out and I did see, my friend, and then I did see my dad, or I did see my daughter, or and you know, kind of trying to dispel some of the myths that can kind of be a kind of narrative that can kind of be like a heavy blanket, that sometimes you don't realize it's there. And it's just unpeeling it and uncovering the person, by showing them that they're myths or they're just beliefs. And that can sometimes be contradictory.
Yes, so where somebody doesn't think there's any improvement, that's their belief. Yeah,
we can become sedimented and kind of fixed. Even though things are changing, we don't kind of feel that they're changing. Being able to kind of show that change in a kind of supportive, not a kind of, you're wrong kind of way, in a very supportive, collegial kind of way, to kind of just show that this seems to be, different. There seems to be some movement. And that if it's kind of my fact rather than the client's fact, then it's not. They have to see it. They have to believe it. It's not about proving someone wrong. It's about being able to almost be like a detective together. You're kind of uncovering things together in a partner way.
Amazing, fascinating.
Yeah, it's such a great tool for self-awareness, isn't it? And understanding yourself. And then understanding how you manage yourself, which I say, I think it's just a great tool for life. And on that, actually, and it's a great question, Anna Maria. Thank you very much for asking it. How can one in the UK? How can one access a CBT expert? What are the different routes?
Yeah, there's lots of different ways of doing that. You can access sometimes, but not always, CBT through your employer. They may have something called an employee assist program, an EAP. This is usually free to employees. They often put a limit of how many sessions that you can have, usually 4 to 6 of those. You might be able to, as I mentioned before, you'll always be able to access CBT via your local talking therapy service. This is free at the point of entry. The assessment to access those across the country is pretty quick, and the probably a couple of weeks until you can get an assessment, and the accessing treatment after that can sometimes vary. It can be anything from 2 to 6 months depending on the area. But there are
sorry, Darren, is that access through your GP, through your NHS, through your GP practice, or is there another route to access?
You can do self, but most of the time it's self-referral. The GP can point you towards the kind of self-referral process. But if you typed in talking therapy, Bedfordshire, Suffolk, Cornwall, wherever, there'll be a link to kind of access, and the GP can point you there. But it's just as quick to go there yourself, and it's dead easy to do. The company that I work for, the parent company, Turning Point, has got a couple of those services across the country, and so they're pretty easy to access.
And that's all free.
All free. And within that, there's an assessment, and the process will kind of determine what type of therapy that you want. I noticed there was a question about group kind of as well as individual kind of here. That many of the talking therapy services offer groups. They might be bespoke groups. There's treatment groups for women. There's treatment groups for men. There's mixed groups. There's kind of topic specific groups as well. And within all that, you can kind of identify your preferences or your wants. If you want to see a male therapist, a female therapist, there are language issues as well. You can access therapy with an interpreter. So that's all absolutely free. And that there's a stepped care model, so that the type of therapy links to the kind of need that you have. So as I mentioned before, if it's mild to moderate, it's generally this type, and if it's kind of more complex, you'll be stepped up towards something more complex. And so I'm a massive advocate, I have to say, of groups. I think that group therapy is incredibly powerful, the power of peers, to be able to challenge in ways which many therapists can't or facilitators can't. but it's not for everyone. And some people don't feel ready to share that kind of content with other people. I'd give it a go. Usually people get to the second one and they're kind of going back for more and more. But that's, if you go to your talking therapy service, they'll tell you about it. You could also access CBT if you've got private medical insurance. I don't know if people do, that always, whenever you're accessing therapy, or you can kind of pay privately for it, you should always look for the therapist to be properly accredited. So there's the professional body is the BABCP, and having accredited BABCP therapist is important. There are also psychologists, so the BPS, the British Psychological Society, is the other professional body for psychology, and always look for people that have got full accreditation from those. Livelife, the company that I work for, employs fully permanently employed therapists, PWPs, and CBT therapists, and yeah, that's one of the many different types of private therapy that people can pay for themselves.
Can I just reiterate that you don't need and I, as a GP, I usually can't refer directly for CBT, but I would often people are a bit disappointed because I say you need to, I signpost to the self-referral. So I work in Leeds, and it's Leeds Mental Wellbeing, and that's where you would refer yourself. But also for women who've had breast cancer or gynecological cancer, any cancer. So some of the charities will offer CBT. So for example, in Leeds, and nationwide, the Maggie's charity, which is maggies.org, I'll put a link in the chat, often offer courses of CBT as well, just as an addition. I'm sure there are other charities that do. I just happen to know the Maggie's one.
And then if people do see a doctor or a CBT specialist privately, Darren, as I know one can through you guys, what does a session typically cost?
They can vary hugely, and it depends a lot on the place and on the therapist. So that you can find individual therapists in your local area if you want to see people face to face, or you can get it online. So typically a 60-minute session can range from £75 to about £200 for an hour session. They are usually weekly sessions. I gave you the frequency before, so you can kind of you get an idea about the total costs. But in some cases, and more often in the last year or so, particularly in terms of the increasing costs of everything, people are asking to reduce the frequency of those sessions, so we can see people fortnightly. I don't think we can do much more than that in terms of the spacing of sessions for CBT. You can do it a bit more for counselling, but it really does make it a bit more tricky in terms of the continuity and the kind of relationship. But people can space them out a little bit, which means that therapy goes on for longer as well. But yeah, so it's roughly about that in terms of cost.
And is the group CBT, is that typically done virtually or in person, Darren, or a bit of both?
It depends on the type. I know that in Leeds, for example, for the talking therapy service, they'll have a mix of both. And there are some types of groups where the evidence base suggests it has to be in person. And there are others where it's okay to do it virtually. And so these are kind of therapeutic groups. There are other types of workshop, which is not therapy, but it's more psychoeducational. So it's talking about a condition or about a treatment, and building people's knowledge and understanding about something, which might then feed into a more therapeutic group to make better use of it. But yeah, it's a mix, and it depends on the area.
Darren, can I just ask, is there anybody who should avoid CBT, or anybody with any certain conditions for whom CBT would not be suitable for?
I think it all gets understood through the assessment. If you're not sure, I go along for the assessment first, and that will be informative in itself. That if people have got historic trauma, CBT can be used. There are certain types of CBT, like something called EMDR, and there's other types of, which are really, really good. And there's a really good evidence base behind it, but you need to make sure that the person that's delivering that type of therapy is properly qualified and the conditions are appropriate to it. Things like, bereavement, there has to be enough time between the kind of the loss and the therapy. So without going into all of that, too much, that I think the therapeutic assessment is a really good place. And so, it can say, well, maybe in a month or two, that bereavement counselling might be better for someone with high risk to themselves because they're feeling maybe suicidal or got suicidality. Then connecting them, not just signposting them, but actively connecting them to a more specialist service would be useful. So I'd kind of take out that nothing is, because it's difficult to kind of know, and use the process to help inform.
Yes, no, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, I think we've had a really brilliant conversation there. Thank you so much, Darren and Dr. Clare, and thank you everyone for your questions. And the video recording will be available. We'll also send out an email to those who signed up to my Menopause Centre Pause newsletter. We'll send you a link to the video, but also we'll include all of the links that we've posted in the chat. So hopefully that addresses your question as well, Marlon. So thank you again, Darren and Dr. Clare. Thank you everyone for joining, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.